So as spring is ramped up, I'm not just looking ahead to the Steam Spring Sale, although I definitely am, but I'm also doing a little bit of spring cleaning when it comes to my gaming habits. And to that end, I actually spent some time kind of clearing out my physical collection back here, which is always in the background of the videos, and I decided I would go ahead and trade up to the PS5 Pro literally by trading in my original PlayStation 5, my Xbox Series S, the PlayStation Portal, and about 10 Switch games that I no longer really needed. And after doing so, not only was I able to snatch up the PlayStation 5 Pro, but I ended up with about $150 in-store credit after the fact. But even though that was a pretty good trade for me, since I got rid of some stuff I really wasn't using that much anymore, it did get me thinking about the reasons why I wasn't using some of that stuff anymore. Specifically, how the Steam Deck and the Steam system overall has really just impacted my console gaming in two specific arenas. One would be game purchases and actually collecting games, and then the other would be my play habits overall. So that's what today's video is all about, is how the Steam Deck has actually disrupted my gaming across other platforms that were around before the Steam Deck ever showed up. Specifically, I'll be looking at how the big three were impacted. That would be PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo, and we're actually going to look at them in that order because those really do represent the order from least amount of impact to most amount of impact. And again, I'm just going to be taking a look at how it impacted the actual act of buying games for those platforms, and how much time I spent with them overall playing since the Steam Deck came on the scene. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and kick this off by talking about the PlayStation brand and how it was the least impacted of the big three whenever I first started getting into the Steam Deck. And let's start with the games. Because when it comes to Sony's first-party exclusives, they are absolutely delightful. And that would include games like Ratchet & Clank, the Horizon games, The Last of Us, Ghost of Tsushima, Bloodborne, Astrobot, I mean the list really just goes on and on. And while a lot of these games, outside of Bloodborne, which hurts me to no end, will eventually trickle down to PC and show up on the Steam Marketplace, I'm just a day one kind of guy who wants to play these experiences as soon as they drop. So if I do end up double dipping on a Sony game that came into the PlayStation first and eventually comes out on PC, usually that's going to happen much later on, and usually not even the day it first comes to PC, and typically just because I want to see how it performs on the Steam Deck or check it out on an ultra-wide display. Plus, even though I've leaned hard into digital purchases for the last several years because of Steam, and it's kind of a necessity when it comes to the Steam Deck, I'm still in the midst of an identity crisis on that front because I'm still very much a physical game collector and will always be a supporter of physical media. Although I have to admit it is really hard to deny the convenience of digital gaming, and ultimately the PlayStation kinda lets me have my cake and eat it too, with tons of great physicals that show up with their exclusives, and also through their game library functionality through PlayStation Plus, it gives me a massive digital library to mess around with as well. So yeah, for a lot of those biggest personal must-have first-party releases, I'm still picking those up on the PlayStation 5, and then also a lot of third-party games as well if it's one that I'm particularly looking forward to, like the Silent Hill 2 remake, for example. Now, when it comes to my personal play habits and how much time I spend playing the PlayStation, that also was negligibly impacted because it's pretty much all-reliable for me when it comes to my personal downtime and the games that I really want to play. Now, as for total playtime, you could argue that there's definitely been some impact because I play a lot of games on the Steam Deck nowadays, usually on my couch and playing in portable mode, not to mention most of my multiplayer friends are also on PlayStation, so it kind of makes sense for me to still spend a significant amount of time there, just because it's easier to squad up, except for those titles that are cross-platform. And that also includes my dad, who's also primarily a PS5 gamer, so it is kind of nice to be able to pick up physical games and then kind of trade those back and forth with him, even if he did steal my copy of Dead Space Remake for longer than was appropriate, but it's okay, I forgive you, Dad. But now let's move on to the Xbox, because it too was pretty negligibly impacted by the Steam Deck, although slightly more so than the PlayStation, but not at all for the same reasons. And that's because outside of the tremendous value that Game Pass represents, there's really not a lot pulling me to play on my Series X at all nowadays, which is also the reason it made me so easy to trade in my Series S, which was just collecting dust. And when it comes to purchasing games for the Xbox, that is the platform for which I buy the least amount of games, physical or otherwise. On the physical front, collecting's always been kind of a mess there to begin with, just because the Xbox One games were always clearly differentiated from the Xbox Series X games, and really they all just kind of blended together anyways. But then on the digital front, Game Pass really has everything that I need. Most of their big first-party exclusives come to Game Pass on day one, and now we're starting to see a lot of their exclusives start to come over to the PlayStation, so there's even less incentive than ever for me to make a purchase there and stay locked into that ecosystem. Although for a time there, the Xbox really was my go-to place to purchase games that had multi-platform releases because it was the most powerful console, and also they had a pretty great commitment to backward compatibility, which I still admire, but ultimately once Steam and the Steam Deck started really becoming a significant portion of my gaming time, it made more sense to consolidate all those third-party releases there more than anything. But again, a combination of Game Pass and the never-ending stream of amazing deals that you can get on Steam means that I just don't have a lot of incentive to buy games on the Xbox platform unless there was some outrageously cool first-party exclusive that had just an awesome collector's edition, I guess, but I would say that's pretty unlikely since I don't even really do that many collector's editions these days. And when it comes to actually playing games on the Xbox, that took a dive as well because, again, I only really have 2 friends that are really nuts about playing on the Xbox platform, and sometimes when I play with them, I don't even log into Xbox Live to do it necessarily for voice chat because they prefer using Discord, so there's been tons of times where I actually just fire up a game like Call of Duty on the PS5 while my friend is on the Xbox. So yeah, the Xbox just isn't getting as much play as it once did, and Steam and Steam Deck played a large part in that. And considering I could stream Game Pass games to my Steam Deck, then it really made it even less appealing for me to actually pick up an Xbox controller and play it in my living room. At the end of the day, with the best of Xbox normally coming to PC on day one anyways, and the fact that a lot of their games are also trickling over to the PlayStation 5 at this point, means that every year that goes on, the Xbox as a hardware platform becomes a little bit less appealing to me. Which, if I'm being honest, is kind of a bummer from a nostalgic standpoint. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't think anybody would call Microsoft like some scrappy underdog, at least not since like the 80s when they first started bringing DOS and Windows to life, but it is kind of sad to think about, how hard they came out of the gate swinging in the early 2000s with the original Xbox and the 360, and to see kind of where they're at now, where all of that's kind of behind them, and they're just trying to get Xbox games in as many places as possible, which is outrageously convenient, I completely agree with that, but it is still kind of a bummer when you think about how much they used to be so committed to taking down PlayStation and, the console wars of yesteryear, I guess. So to really tie the whole Xbox piece together, I guess all I can say is that my appreciation for Xbox was kind of already on the decline, but then when you take into account Steam's ability to provide tons of amazing deals on games that made it easy for me to enjoy now on the Steam Deck and also on my desktop gaming rig, and really consolidate my third-party releases there instead of on the Xbox, really just made the Steam Deck another nail in the coffin of my appreciation for the Xbox platform as a whole. And speaking of hybrid gaming scenarios, it does sadden me a little bit to say that Nintendo took the absolute biggest hit when the Steam Deck came on the scene, perhaps unsurprisingly. Now, when it comes to gaming purchases, at least physically, the Switch had pretty much been my top dog since it first debuted back in 2017, and even now it represents the overwhelming largest portion of my physical collection by a landslide. And that's because a lot of their biggest first-party releases usually have some really cool collector's editions like they did for Breath of the Wild when that first launched alongside the Switch, or the Metroid Dread Collector's Edition which came with that really slick steelbook which you don't see Nintendo do that often. Not to mention the Switch became an absolute port machine in the ensuing years, bringing a ton of great games from the 6th generation over, like BioShock, Skyrim, Borderlands, Saints Row the Third, and really that list just goes on. And that's to say nothing of the quote-unquote impossible ports that came to the system, including games like No Man's Sky, Wolfenstein, Doom, Witcher 3, and a whole bunch of other heavy hitters that through some dark manage were able to be squeezed onto the Switch's more meager hardware. And I just went ham on a lot of these games, not necessarily because they were the most pretty version of those games, because they definitely weren't, but because the idea of having these experiences on the go was just too good to pass up, and I didn't even mind double dipping on games I already owned just so I could take games I'd already played on the 360 in my living room and be able to take them with me wherever I wanted to. However, that was also in the middle of the Switch's heyday between 2017 and 2022, where the idea of having hybrid play was not a novelty but a legitimate game changer, and competition for a device like that was pretty much non-existent at the time. And during that time I was on the go a lot more often, so the idea of having games that compromised a little bit of visual quality for on-the-go convenience just made a whole lot more sense. And when the much beefier Steam Deck did show up in 2022, I didn't realize it immediately, but eventually it became clear that my days of collecting third-party titles for the Nintendo Switch was effectively over. So last weekend when it came time to trade in my PS5 for a PS5 Pro, and sort of supplement that trade-in with some games that I no longer needed, the Switch was a pretty easy target considering I had a litany of third-party titles that I also had in my Steam library that really didn't make sense to hold on to any longer. But beyond disrupting my game collecting and purchasing habits for the Nintendo Switch, the Steam Deck also put a pretty significant hurting on the amount of time I spent playing it as well. Because at that point, anytime I did want to play a game portably, or at least one that wasn't a first-party exclusive for the Nintendo Switch, or it wasn't a situation where I just want to play something that I could grab and go with, the Steam Deck was always the system that I was reaching for. Don't get me wrong, the latest Nintendo console is always going to be in my lineup and I will always be there day one to purchase it, and I couldn't be more excited for the Switch 2 whenever it launches later this year. The only thing that I am saying is that this is a different landscape for the Switch in 2025 than it was in 2017, and there are multiple PC-based hybrids available that compete pretty easily with the Nintendo Switch. And while I'm sure the Switch 2 is going to have some amazing first-party titles, I can't see myself really buying any third-party titles for it outside of maybe one or two novelty purchases, and I pretty much accept at this point that anything moving forward that I do buy for Nintendo will probably exclusively be, well, for exclusives. So yeah, overall it's probably not surprising that the Steam Deck put a pretty significant dent in my console collecting and play habits, although it was fun to go ahead and take a look in a more nuanced way at exactly how it impacted each one of those major platforms individually. But hey, what about you? Did the Steam Deck impact any of your console gaming habits in any significant way, or just maybe supplement your PC gaming habits? I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Now, as far as what's coming up on the channel, this weekend I will be doing the 3rd episode of Twist, where we'll probably lean pretty heavily into spring sale stuff since that kicks off here in a couple of days, and then next week I'll definitely be doing a spring sale pickups video of sorts, talking about some of the games that I personally grabbed while I could get them at a discount. So, as always, thank you so much for your time and hanging out here on the channel with me. It means a lot to me. Take care, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.